Today, Samsung is synonymous with sleek screens, foldable phones, and cutting-edge innovation. It's a name etched into every shopping mall, every pocket, every glowing billboard. The South Korean tech titan powers half the digital devices we use, and its reach stretches from smartphones to shipbuilding, from insurance to skyscrapers. But behind the shimmering facade of futuristic consumer technology lies a history rarely spoken aloud, a story built not on code and circuitry, but on war, political corruption, labor abuse, and iron-fisted dynastic control. Because Samsung didn't simply rise, it was built atop the bones of a broken nation, shaped by the chaos of occupation, and empowered by deals struck far from the boardroom. This is not just a story about business, it's a story about power. To understand Samsung's true origin, we must go back not to the launch of the Galaxy phone, or even the 1980s tech boom, but to a Korea on its knees. The year was 1938. The country was under brutal Japanese colonial rule, and the wounds of cultural erasure ran deep. It was in this bleak environment that a young man named Lee Byung-chul founded a small trading company in the southeastern town of Daegu. The business? Exporting dried fish, vegetables, and noodles to Manchuria and Beijing. It was called Samsung Sangho. The name Samsung means 3 stars, symbolizing something big, numerous, and powerful. A fitting prophecy. But Lee was no ordinary trader. Born to a wealthy landowning family, he was well-educated, ambitious, and politically connected. He understood the winds of power and positioned himself accordingly, leveraging his business acumen in a time when collaboration with colonial rulers could mean survival or even prosperity. By carefully navigating Japanese bureaucracy, Lee expanded Samsung's operations into flour milling and sugar refining industries dominated by monopolies. And in 1945, when Korea gained its independence and the Japanese empire collapsed, Lee was well positioned to pivot, turning imperial connections into post-colonial advantage. But Korea's liberation was not peace. It was a vacuum, one soon filled by American occupation in the south, Soviet influence in the north, and a brewing ideological divide that would soon erupt into the Korean War. Lee Byung-chul, ever the pragmatist, aligned himself with US-backed anti-communist forces. It was here in the ashes of war that Samsung truly began its transformation, not just as a company, but as a pillar of a rising national identity shaped by Cold War politics. During the Korean War, Lee fled to Busan, taking Samsung's capital with him. As Seoul crumbled under invasion, Samsung traded in consumer goods and provided logistics for the South Korean government. After the war, South Korea lay in ruin, its economy devastated, infrastructure, gutted, population traumatized. But it was also a land of opportunity for those who could seize it. And Lee did. The 1960s brought a new force to power: President Park Chung-hee, a military strongman who seized control in a coup d'etat. Park's vision was clear. He wanted to drag South Korea out of poverty and into modernity at breakneck speed. His method: authoritarianism backed by industrial planning and aggressive centralization. And for that, he needed allies in the private sector. He needed chaebols. Chaebol is a uniquely Korean term, meaning family-run conglomerates often sprawling across dozens of industries, bound together not by product lines, but by dynastic control and government favoritism. And Samsung under Lee Byung-chul became the model. Park provided tax breaks, favorable loans, state protection, and virtual monopolies. In return, Samsung pledged loyalty and rapid expansion. By the mid-1960s, Samsung had its hands in textiles, fertilizers, insurance, electronics, shipbuilding, and even media. Every time a new strategic industry emerged, the government directed Samsung into it. Every time Samsung stumbled, the state propped it up. This was no free market, it was corporate nationalism. But the relationship wasn't just economic, it was deeply political. Lee Byung-chul became one of the most powerful unelected figures in the country. His donations to the ruling party were generous. His influence over economic policy was unrivaled. And as Samsung grew, so did its grip on Korean life. Workers were paid little, unionizing was dangerous, and dissent was stifled. The company demanded loyalty, not just from employees, but from the nation. This was the dark bargain of the Korean miracle: rapid growth in exchange for silence. As the 1970s progressed, Samsung's electronics division, founded in 1969, began manufacturing black and white televisions, washing machines, and refrigerators. The products weren't groundbreaking, but they were cheap and scalable. With government subsidies, Samsung could undercut foreign competition, dominate the domestic market, and eventually build the capacity to export. But behind the glossy plastic and glowing screens, laborers worked grueling hours in conditions that would today spark international outrage. In factories, young women were preferred, deemed more obedient, less likely to unionize. Many lived in dormitories owned by Samsung, earning barely enough to survive. Safety regulations were weak and illness was rampant, yet few dared to speak. By 1980, Samsung had become a nation within a nation. It owned banks, newspapers, construction firms, and laboratories. It had its own universities, hospitals, and research centers. It was not simply part of Korea's economy, it was Korea's economy. But with size came scrutiny. In 1980, Lee Byung-chul's son, Lee Kun-hee, took over the electronics division. Groomed since youth, Lee Kun-hee had studied in Japan and the United States, absorbing the latest in global management theory. Under his leadership, Samsung Electronics began to pivot. No longer content with cheap exports, Kun-hee envisioned a company that could rival Sony, IBM, and eventually Apple. But before that vision could be realized, a scandal erupted that threatened the entire empire. In 1982, it was revealed that Samsung executives had made illegal political contributions and colluded with government officials to suppress labor unions. Lee Byung-chul, under pressure, resigned from his position as chairman. But the resignation was symbolic. Within months, he returned quietly, and Samsung continued unabated. No one went to prison. No meaningful reforms were implemented. The scandal faded. This cycle of corruption, exposure, resignation, return would become a pattern in Samsung's story. It is the rhythm of impunity. In the late 1980s, South Korea began to democratize. Protests forced the military government to hold elections. Free speech blossomed. Civil society strengthened. But the chaebol remained untouched. Their power, forged in dictatorship, carried over into democracy through sheer inertia. Politicians needed their money. The media needed their advertising. The economy depended on their stability. And so, Samsung adapted. It polished its image. It spoke the language of innovation, of national pride, of Korean excellence. It launched campaigns celebrating its workers, its factories, its vision. But behind the scenes, little changed. By 1990, Lee Kun-hee formally took over the entire Samsung group. His mandate was bold: transform Samsung into a world-class technology brand. And so began what many call the second Samsung. Under Kun-hee, the company invested heavily in R&D, hired foreign consultants, sent executives abroad for training. He famously told his employees to change everything but your wife and children. Factories were rebuilt. Quality standards were tightened. Branding was overhauled. By the mid-1990s, Samsung had become a true global contender in semiconductors, displays, and eventually mobile phones. But the darkness never left. The company was dogged by reports of union-busting, labor abuse, and environmental negligence. Workers in its chip factories developed leukemia at alarming rates. When families sought answers, they were met with silence, and in some cases legal intimidation. Whistleblowers were harassed. Some were sued, others were bought off. Internally, Samsung operated like a monarchy. Decisions flowed from the top. Dissent was not tolerated. The Lee family controlled vast shares of the company through opaque holding structures. Executives were expected to pledge loyalty not just to the firm, but to the family. In essence, Samsung was a state within a state, a dynasty above democracy, and its influence only grew. By the year 2000, Samsung Electronics had become South Korea's largest company. It accounted for over 20% of the nation's exports. Its stock made up a third of the Kospi index. Its reach extended to every corner of Korean life, from the chips in your phone to the insurance on your car, from the skyscrapers in Seoul to the sitcoms on TV. But what the world saw was different. To outsiders, Samsung was a miracle, a shining symbol of South Korea's transformation from war-torn poverty to technological superpower. It sponsored the Olympics. It opened flagship stores in New York, Paris, and Tokyo. It competed with Apple. It hired Western designers, launched billion-dollar ad campaigns, and flooded the market with sleek, futuristic devices. The world fell in love with Samsung's products, but few asked how it got here. By the early 2000s, Samsung had already eclipsed its domestic origins and firmly planted itself in the global arena. It wasn't just South Korea's pride, it was a contender on the world stage. But its rise to dominance wasn't only built on innovation branding or efficient manufacturing. It was carved from a complex matrix of geopolitical strategy, legal warfare, anti-union tactics, and a relentless corporate philosophy win at all costs. This part of the story peels away the glamour of the global Samsung brand and uncovers the machinery of control beneath it. When Lee Kun-hee took over Samsung Group in the 1990s, he made one thing clear: the company would no longer be satisfied with copying Japan or servicing Western brands. It would lead. And to lead it, had to outmaneuver giants like Sony, Motorola, Nokia, and eventually Apple. So Samsung embarked on a decade of transformation that would come to redefine not only the company, but entire industries. It started with components. While Sony focused on sleek designs and Motorola on stylish flip phones, Samsung quietly became the world's largest manufacturer of DRAM memory chips and LCD panels. These weren't just for Samsung's own products, they powered the devices of its competitors. Apple's iPhones, Sony's TVs, even Hewlett-Packard laptops, they all contained Samsung parts. In a world where speed and efficiency ruled, Samsung made itself indispensable. This dual strategy, selling components to rivals while competing with them in the consumer space, was unprecedented. It blurred the line between supplier and adversary. It allowed Samsung to profit regardless of who won. But it also gave them access to proprietary technologies, market forecasts, and global pricing structures. Some called it brilliant, others called it predatory. Samsung's international business practices became increasingly aggressive. The company was accused of price fixing in the memory chip market. In 2005, US and EU regulators fined Samsung and other companies for colluding to fix DRAM prices, an act that cost consumers and manufacturers billions. Samsung paid $300 million in US fines, the second largest antitrust penalty in American history at the time. But that was just the beginning. When Apple launched the iPhone in 2007, the smartphone revolution began, and Samsung saw an opening. Initially, Samsung was a supplier for Apple. It manufactured the processors that powered the first iPhones. But internally, Samsung engineers were rapidly reverse engineering the device. Within a few years, Samsung had launched its own smartphones, the Galaxy line, powered by Google's Android system, with eerily similar designs and functionality. Apple sued. The legal battle became one of the most high-profile intellectual property disputes of the 21st century. Apple accused Samsung of slavishly copying its products. Samsung countered with its own lawsuits. The cases spanned courts in the US, South Korea, Germany, Japan, and Australia. Billions of dollars were at stake. In 2012, a US jury awarded Apple over $1 billion in damages. The verdict was a shock. But Samsung didn't blink. It appealed, delayed, countersued, and dragged the process out for nearly a decade. The final settlement, reached in 2018, was for $539 million. A staggering amount, but barely a dent in Samsung's empire. By then, Samsung had already overtaken Apple as the world's largest smartphone maker in terms of units sold. This was not defeat, it was calculated attrition. And while the courtroom drama played out, Samsung expanded relentlessly. It built sprawling manufacturing complexes in Vietnam, India, and China. It negotiated tax holidays with governments, received massive incentives, and became the largest foreign investor in several countries. In return, these nations received jobs, thousands of them, but also dependents. Vietnam is perhaps the most striking example. Samsung accounts for over 20% of Vietnam's total exports. Its presence is so significant that fluctuations in Samsung's quarterly earnings directly impact the Vietnamese economy. Workers assemble phones in giant factories, often under harsh conditions, long shifts, and immense pressure to meet global demand. Stories have emerged of fainting spells, repetitive strain injuries, and suppressed labor movements. But the company denies systemic issues, and the host governments rarely intervene. They need Samsung. This imbalance of power is replicated around the world. In India, Samsung lobbied aggressively to avoid import duties and environmental restrictions. In China, it leveraged state relationships to secure favorable land and tax policies. In the US, Samsung has poured money into lobbying Congress over $5 million in recent years to influence tech policy, trade regulations, and antitrust legislation. It wasn't just markets that Samsung dominated, it was institutions. Back in South Korea, its grip on the nation grew tighter. Despite public efforts to diversify the economy, Samsung and a few other chaebol continued to control the lion's share of the GDP. Politicians campaigned with Samsung's shadow looming behind them. Presidents who challenged the chaebol often found their careers cut short. Some ended up in jail, others in disgrace. Samsung, by contrast, always landed on its feet, even as new corruption scandals emerged. In 2007, Samsung's former chief legal advisor, Kim Yong-chul, became a whistleblower. He alleged that the company maintained slush funds to bribe prosecutors, judges, and politicians. He claimed to have personally delivered millions of dollars to top officials on behalf of Lee Kun-hee. Samsung denied the allegations, but the evidence was mounting. Lee Kun-hee was indicted and found guilty of tax evasion and breach of trust. He received a suspended sentence and later a full presidential pardon issued ironically in the name of ensuring South Korea's success at the Beijing Olympics, where Samsung was a major sponsor. It was déjà vu. The patriarch steps down in shame, the family retains control, the company apologizes, the headlines fade, and business continues. But the dynasty's problems were just beginning. Lee Kun-hee suffered a heart attack in 2014 and fell into a coma. His son, Lee Jae-yong, assumed de facto leadership of Samsung. Educated at Harvard and fluent in English, he was the perfect face of a globalized Samsung, young, cosmopolitan, and modern. But within a few years, he too was engulfed in scandal. In 2016, South Korea was rocked by a corruption crisis. President Park Geun-hye was accused of accepting bribes from major chaebol in exchange for political favors. At the heart of the investigation was Samsung. Prosecutors alleged that Samsung donated tens of millions of dollars to organizations linked to Park's confidant Choi Soon-sil in exchange for government support of a controversial merger that would solidify Lee Jae-yong's control over the group. Lee was arrested, tried, and in 2017 sentenced to 5 years in prison. The image of the heir in handcuffs, escorted through a gauntlet of cameras, stunned the world. Was this finally accountability? Not quite. Lee's sentence was reduced on appeal. He was released after less than a year. Then rearrested. Then released again. The legal saga dragged on technicalities, retrials, suspended sentences. In 2021, he was released once more under the banner of economic necessity. Once again, Samsung's future was deemed too important for justice. This is the pattern: scandal, apology, redemption, repeat. And through it all, Samsung continues to innovate. Its phones push technological boundaries. Its semiconductor division leads the world in memory and logic chips. Its displays power everything from TVs to aircraft. It is both the face of progress and the ghost of unchecked power. The world sees Samsung as a tech company, but it is more than that. It is a global political actor, a manufacturing empire, a diplomatic asset, a monopolistic force, and perhaps most dangerously, it is a symbol that success excuses everything. As Samsung's empire spread across continents and industries, its brand gleamed brighter than ever. Cutting-edge phones, curved displays, AI-powered appliances, self-driving car components, Samsung was the icon of the modern digital age. Its innovations were lauded, its products reviewed, its launches live-streamed by millions. But beneath the shimmer of new technology lies a story few are willing to see. A story not written in code or patents, but in sweat, silence, and sacrifice. This chapter is about the labor behind the innovation, the hands that assembled the devices, the lungs that inhaled the chemicals, the voices that were silenced when they tried to speak. Because Samsung's empire is not only built on brilliant engineering, but on control. Control over its workers, control over its image, control over the very systems that were supposed to hold it accountable. It begins in the factories. Samsung's rise as a tech powerhouse required a vast army of workers, fast, cheap, and compliant. From the late 1980s to the early 2000s, tens of thousands of young women filled Samsung's semiconductor plants. They were efficient, docile by design. They worked long hours, rotating shifts, handling toxic chemicals like benzene trichloroethylene and formaldehyde, often without proper protection. They were told it was safe. They were told it was clean. It wasn't. Over time, workers began to get sick. First one, then another, then dozens. Young women in their 20s were suddenly diagnosed with leukemia brain tumors, multiple sclerosis reproductive disorders. Some died. Others lived but were left infertile in chronic pain or with compromised immune systems. At first, Samsung denied it all. The company said the illnesses were isolated incidents. It cited internal safety audits. It insisted there was no causal link between factory conditions and the rise in cancers. But the numbers told a different story. By the mid-2000s, over 200 former Samsung workers or their families had reported serious illnesses they believed were linked to their time in the factories. One of those workers was Huang Yumi. She was 22 years old when she died of leukemia in 2007, just 2 years after joining Samsung's semiconductor division. Her father, Huang Sanqi, was devastated, but he refused to be silent. He demanded an investigation. He demanded answers. But Samsung did not offer condolences. It offered a settlement. Quiet money. Huang refused. He wanted justice. And so began a legal battle that would span more than a decade. With the help of labor activists and civil society groups, Huang took Samsung to court. The company fought back with everything it had: lawyers, PR campaigns, medical experts. It denied wrongdoing. It questioned the science. It argued causality was impossible to prove. It wasn't until 2018, 11 years after Yumi's death, that Samsung finally issued a formal apology. Then Chairman Kim Ki-nam bowed deeply before cameras. The company agreed to compensate affected families. But it never admitted legal liability. For many, the apology rang hollow. By that point, over 240 former workers had filed claims. The company had spent millions fighting them. Many victims died before seeing a single one of compensation. And the pattern continued in other factories, other regions, other countries. In Vietnam, Samsung's largest foreign manufacturing hub, reports began to surface of miscarriages, dizziness, and fainting spells among female workers on the smartphone assembly lines. Workers described high-speed quotas, minimal breaks, and exposure to unknown chemicals. When reporters from The Guardian and other outlets attempted to investigate, they were blocked. Workers were warned not to speak. Interviews were conducted in secret. Again, Samsung denied wrongdoing. The company said its factories met international standards. It said its workers were safe, that health was a top priority. And yet independent access remained restricted. The Vietnamese government, heavily reliant on Samsung's investment, looked the other way. Silence returned. In South Korea, workers who attempted to unionize were often dismissed, harassed, or blacklisted. For decades, Samsung maintained an unofficial no-union policy, one that went unchallenged by the government. Managers received manuals on how to suppress labor organizing. Surveillance was rampant. Informants were embedded. Dissent was crushed before it could spread. This wasn't policy, it was doctrine. Internal documents leaked in 2013 revealed Samsung's comprehensive union-busting strategy. The documents detailed how to monitor workers, divide potential organizers, and sow distrust. It was chilling. The company apologized again, but the pattern didn't change. In 2020, Samsung's top executives, including then Vice Chairman Lee Sang-hoon, were convicted of violating labor laws specifically for targeting union leaders with intimidation and coercion. The court found that Samsung had engaged in systemic illegal suppression of labor rights. The sentences mostly suspended, fines, a few months served, no structural change. And still the devices flowed. Because for all the pain, all the disease, all the broken families, Samsung's business was booming. Its chips powered every phone. Its displays filled every living room. Its appliances populated kitchens across the globe. The media dependent on Samsung's advertising rarely investigated. The courts moved slowly. The public, dazzled by innovation, looked away. This is the machinery of denial, global, efficient, and expertly maintained. But not everyone looked away. A growing network of labor activists, whistleblowers, and journalists began to push back. They documented illnesses. They built archives. They sued. They marched. In 2015, a documentary titled The Empire of Shame exposed the suffering of Samsung workers in harrowing detail. The film was banned from many theaters in South Korea, but it found an audience online and internationally. Public pressure grew. By 2018, Samsung finally agreed to compensate workers who had fallen ill in its chip factories. It created an independent mediation committee, a long overdue attempt at accountability. But even then, many critics argued the move was calculated a PR maneuver to contain a reputational crisis, not a true reckoning with the company's past. Because when a company has this much power, even the truth can be managed. Samsung's influence is not limited to factories or supply chains. It extends into politics, media, and academia. It funds university research. It owns shares in TV networks and newspapers. It donates to politicians across the spectrum. This reach has allowed Samsung to shape narratives, suppress criticism, and craft a public image that rarely matches its internal culture. Former employees who spoke out often found themselves blacklisted. Academics who studied Samsung's labor practices reported difficulty publishing. Editors were pressured. Stories were spiked. Truth in Samsung's world was not something discovered, it was something negotiated. And all the while, the Lee family retained control. Despite scandals, indictments, and even jail time, the dynasty held firm. When Lee Kun-hee died in 2020, his son Lee Jae-yong took full control of the empire. He promised a new era, one of transparency, reform, modernization. But critics were skeptical. After all, Lee himself had been convicted twice of corruption, twice pardoned, and still in charge. Reform cannot come from a throne built on secrecy. So where does that leave us? In the final chapter, we will explore the reckoning, the movement pushing for a post-Samsung Korea, the new generation of labor leaders, reformers, and whistleblowers refusing to be silenced. We will ask what accountability looks like in the age of corporate feudalism and whether a company like Samsung can ever truly be reformed. Because innovation is not the same as integrity, and behind every screen, there are stories, too many of them buried, but not forgotten. Samsung today is more than a company. It is an institution, a shadow state, a household name, a global brand, a technological empire that stretches across industries, continents, and generations. But it is also something else, a mirror. One that reflects back the uneasy questions of our age about power, accountability, and whether the modern corporation can ever be tamed. In this final chapter, we step beyond the boardrooms and factories and into the spaces where resistance brews. Because even as Samsung tightened its grip on technology, labor politics, and narrative opposition has emerged, often fragmented, often vulnerable, but undeniably growing. And with each passing year, the myth of invincibility that surrounds the Samsung empire is being chipped away. We begin with a simple truth: dynasty's end. In 2020, Lee Kun-hee, the second patriarch of Samsung and the architect of its global domination, died at the age of 78. He had spent the final 6 years of his life in a coma. The moment should have marked a symbolic transition, a chance for Samsung to start anew, but instead it exposed the very rot at the core of the conglomerate's structure. Upon his death, the Lee family faced the largest inheritance tax in South Korean history, over $10 billion. The law was clear. The state required that 50% of the estate's value be paid. But the Lee family's network of cross-shareholdings, offshore entities, and financial instruments had long shielded them from direct exposure. Through clever restructuring and state negotiations, they paid some of the tax, mostly through donations of artwork and company stock, while maintaining near-absolute control of Samsung. Lee Jae-yong, the third-generation heir, now stood at the helm. Convicted of bribery, embezzlement, and perjury, he had served less than 2 years of a 5-year sentence. Twice pardoned by 2 different presidents, his leadership was touted as essential to the nation's economy. His crimes, it seemed, were forgivable, so long as the company's quarterly earnings remained strong. It was a message South Korea had heard before, but this time something was different. Public sentiment was shifting. A growing number of citizens, especially the young, were tired of the chaebol culture, the impunity, the nepotism, the monopoly. They were tired of job markets dominated by a few conglomerates, of housing prices pushed up by corporate speculation, of political systems warped by corporate donations. And they began to push back. Independent media outlets, freed from the grip of traditional advertising models, began publishing exposés. Documentaries circulated on YouTube and Netflix, telling the stories mainstream broadcasters wouldn't touch. Social media allowed whistleblowers to bypass traditional gatekeepers. A new generation of lawmakers entered the National Assembly, some openly campaigning on promises to break the chaebol's grip. One of the most significant legal reforms came in 2020, when the South Korean government passed the Serious Accidents Punishment Act. Designed to hold corporate executives criminally liable for workplace deaths and injuries, the law was seen as a direct response to decades of industrial negligence, Samsung included. It was not perfect, but it was a crack in the armor. At the same time, global pressure mounted. International labor organizations began demanding that Samsung open its overseas factories to independent inspection. Consumer watchdogs in Europe and North America pushed for transparency in supply chains. Ethical tech movements questioned the human cost of smartphones. ESG investors began scrutinizing Samsung's labor record, environmental practices, and governance. Even within the company, change was stirring. Younger Samsung employees, especially in tech and design divisions, began advocating for greater workplace rights. Some formed unofficial networks, others leaked documents, a few staged walkouts. For the first time in decades, the word union began to lose its taboo within the walls of Samsung. It wasn't a revolution, but it was resistance. Meanwhile, the families of workers who died from leukemia, brain tumors, and other occupational diseases refused to disappear. They continued to meet, to speak, to honor the names of the dead. They built digital memorials. They published books. They lobbied for legal reform. And every time a court ruled in their favor, a little more of Samsung's mask fell away. Yet the company continued to perform its dual act. It promised change while lobbying behind closed doors to weaken reforms. It funded innovation centers while pressuring journalists to drop investigations. It created environmental initiatives while relying on coal-powered plants for chip production. It pledged to do better while maintaining the same dynastic control that had fueled its rise. So what does justice look like? It begins with honesty. Samsung, like many global giants, has mastered the language of responsibility. But language is not enough. Words must be followed by action, independent audits, worker-led councils, true unionization, environmental accountability, and legal consequences, not just for scapegoats, but for the powerful. Justice also means memory. The stories of Samsung's factory workers, those who died in silence, those who fought and were punished, must not be lost to corporate erasure. They must be taught, shared, remembered. Their lives were not collateral damage. They were the foundation. Justice means reforming the system that made Samsung possible. A system where government and business were never separate, where public officials became corporate board members, where the courts bent under pressure, where media remained complicit in exchange for ad dollars. That system must be dismantled, or it will continue to create new empires, new tragedies, new apologies. And finally, justice means choice. For consumers, for workers, for voters. Samsung is not evil because it builds phones or TVs. It is dangerous because it was allowed to become untouchable, because it operated above the law for decades, because its power went unchecked. But it can be checked if we choose to see, if we choose to act. This film does not end with a tidy resolution. The story of Samsung is not over. It continues in boardrooms, on factory floors, in courtrooms, in classrooms, and in the hands of every person who holds a device bearing that familiar blue logo. The question is, what will we do with what we now know? Because history has shown us one thing clearly: corporations do not change out of guilt. They change under pressure. So if we want a better future, one where innovation is not built on exploitation, then we must become that pressure. Because behind every empire is a choice, and behind every screen a cost.